Did you know that France was the first NATO member to question America's intentions with Europe after World War II? Fast forward to recent years, and we saw the embers of this distrust during Trump's first presidency, especially with his controversial tariff policies targeting French wine. While I'm sure that Donald Trump thought he'd hit France hard with these tariffs, they ended up impacting American restaurants, bars, and wine stores even more severely, causing significant revenue losses and closures in the US. In our recent videos, we've explored the growing tension among NATO members over Europe's reliance on their ally across the Atlantic now that Trump is once again in power. We've also looked at how Northern European countries are banding together within NATO to form the Joint Expeditionary Force. Today, we'll delve into a related issue: France's long-standing skepticism toward American dominance in European and NATO military affairs. Looking back, it almost seems prophetic. Charles de Gaulle, France's first president after World War II and again in the 1950s, once said in 1968, "You may be sure that the Americans will commit all the stupidities they can think of, plus some that are beyond imagination." Remarkably, just 2 years prior to this statement, France had made a bold move by withdrawing from NATO's integrated military command and requested that all American troops leave French soil. De Gaulle's vision was for Europe to be self-reliant in defense, a vision that today appears more relevant than ever with Donald Trump threatening allies left, right, and center. De Gaulle had been through a lot. He was the leader of the French provisional government during much of World War II. His Free French troops landed on the beaches with the British, Canadians, and Americans during D-Day after having fought their way through much of Africa with the British. He would later lay the groundwork for NATO's most independent military until Sweden and Finland joined some 80 years later. I'm Tuomas, a former officer in the Finnish Defense Forces. Today, we'll explore how France's approach to military self-reliance, a strategy many European nations are now considering, has allowed it to maintain near-complete independence from American influence in its defense acquisitions. France provides a template for the EU and Europe now that the US is proving entirely unreliable. I'm well aware that this video might slightly annoy many of our subscribers, in particular my British audience. But in order for Europe to move on and take more responsibility for our own fates, we need to put historic differences aside. France has set a template for how Europe can disengage from how the US defense industry has used Europe as its piggy bank for years. Through deft investment, great engineering, and prioritizing its own security over various US-led wars, France is leading the way in how Europe could gain diplomatic leverage and independence from its US counterpart. Not only that, but it has expeditionary forces who aren't afraid of taking on France's adversaries in Africa and beyond. It made its own nuclear umbrella against the protests of the Americans, and it shows Europe that we're supposed to be allies, rather than subservient nations. First, let's roll back the clock a little. As early as the 1950s, France was growing tired of US interference in their country. Not only did the US want to replace the French franc with the dollar shortly after World War II, it also initially wanted to split up the country, like it did Germany, where several other allies would govern parts of the country on account of what the US argued as collaboration with the Germans during World War II. Even the Brits argued against this American idea, and when France's suggestion of the founding of a European army was continuously rebuffed by the US several times in the 50s, France was starting to lose patience. The 20 or so NATO bases in France was starting to feel more like a quasi-occupation than a security force, and its mostly American soldiers were living a much better life than the average French person outside the base perimeter. While European debt made America rich, both Britain and France struggled under the burden of repaying the US and fixing their war-torn countries at the same time. As the French continued to struggle abroad in Indochina and Algeria, de Gaulle was elected as Prime Minister of France in 1958. One of his first decrees was to create France's own nuclear deterrent, which it famously only took France 2 years to finish. A few short weeks after his election win, he also stated that France's place in the NATO organization must be reconsidered. The Americans have an overwhelming preponderance in the organization of commands. we are completely kept away from the plans drawn up by the Supreme Allied Commander. This remark, in common tongue, meant that France was not going to let the US place short-range ballistic nuclear missiles in their country, without France at least having the chance to discuss any potential launch with the US. In 1965, France was officially done. They withdrew from NATO's military hierarchy and ordered that all US NATO personnel had to leave its country by 1967. Most American personnel was moved to Belgium. From here on out, France had set its course. It would remain an ally of NATO outside of its military command, but not adhere to Article 5, and it didn't rejoin the military part of the alliance until 2009. Instead, it kept reinforcing close ties to its EU allies and kept advocating for an EU federal armed force. While many of France's European neighbors may not have understood what France was up to, what France did has later proven extremely effective in defending its own economy, sovereignty, and defense industry. The France we know today has one of Europe's premier active land armies, a sprawling military industry, and one of only 2 nuclear deterrents in the European part of NATO with its 290 submarine and air-launched ballistic missiles. For as long as I can remember, France was always that loud guy in the room that would argue for an EU army, a European standing reserve, and for European nations to invest in European products. Today, many EU leaders are probably wondering why no one listened to them. The re-election of Donald Trump seems to have awoken something in Europe, and in many parts of the Union, he's become the issue that is causing the old infighting nations of Europe to start thinking about how they can become independent as a bloc. While France's poor showing in World War II was probably not a great advert for its military industry, it does produce some of the world's most advanced hardware. Tanks, artillery, airplanes, complete naval vessels all the way from aircraft carriers to submarines, IFVs, APCs, drones, air defense, and missiles. There's very little the French defense sector doesn't produce, and some of it is at the top echelon of quality on the world stage. In fact, France is now the world's second largest exporter of military equipment and arms, owning about 11% of the world market in 2022. Take France's incredible Dassault Rafale fighter jet, now going into its 4th modernization. It's just been sold in large quantities to India, Egypt, UAE, Croatia, Indonesia, and Qatar. It is the only European jet left that can land on an aircraft carrier, and it is this quality that makes it incredibly attractive to, among others, India and Indonesia. From 2021, France sold a staggering 323 of this aircraft abroad, making it the most exported fighter jet in the world after 2021. Better yet, with the newest upgrades, this fighter jet is able to get a lock on the American F-35, meaning that the whole advantage of the ridiculously expensive F-35 in operational terms is negated by a jet that costs somewhere along the lines of half or 2/3 less per flight hour. France and Sweden with its Gripen has effectively ended the era of so-called stealth aircraft, and at the same time shown that it is possible to operate your air force without the ridiculous cost seen with American new generation jets. Moreover, France was the biggest exporter of major warships in the world in 2022, with 20 ships sold to Egypt, the US, Greece, and Guyana, while other allies like the Netherlands and Indonesia has also bought different vessels from the French in 2023, with the Dutch buying 4 Barracuda-class submarines. Australia initially chose the highly regarded Barracuda-class submarines from France, but due to pressure from the US, the order was cancelled in favor of American submarines. Given the current climate, where Donald Trump is exerting pressure on NATO allies like Canada and Denmark, I believe it would be wise for Australia to reconsider their original decision and revisit the purchase of the Barracuda-class submarines. While 2024 is still being summarized, the ongoing success of the Caesar in Ukraine has made this a sought-after artillery piece. Nexter, who produces the Caesar, is struggling with keeping up with demand and expects to make 144 of this brilliant self-propelled gun per year. Nexter recently showed the Caesar Mark II to the market, and based on intelligence and data gathered from the performance of the system in Ukraine, it now uses AI for counter-battery fire, has doubled its engine power to 460 horsepowers, and has ironed out some of the kinks around maneuverability. Thales of the Netherlands have aided Nexter in adding an integrated drone jammer in the cabin, and based on how electronic warfare has been an issue for many systems in Ukraine, its GPS system is upgraded with an inertial component which takes over if the vehicle is jammed. I could go on about French-made equipment all day, but the last few pieces of kit that I'll mention is in the armored warfare, air defense and missile department. The Leclerc XLR, France's newest main battle tank, comes complete with a total new suite of anti-drone and IED jammers, integrated drone launchers, active armor and a remote-controlled turret. Currently, at least 200 of France's Leclerc 3 are being upgraded to this variant. Equally, France produces its very own armored vehicles to fill all the roles required by a modern army. For example, the AFV named VBCI, the wheeled APC Griffon, and the mine-resistant multi-role Serval. Furthermore, they make the excellent SAMP-T air defense system in cooperation with Italy, and are also jointly producing one of Ukraine's real success weapons, the Scalp Storm Shadow long-range ballistic missile. Overall, it is estimated that France, having invested in European hardware rather than American since around 1960, has spent a staggering 50 billion euros, converted into the currency of 2025, every year since about 1960, on pretty much only European armaments, jobs, and initiatives. Safe to say that France has put their money where their mouth is, as we say. It is estimated that France has 5,000 defense companies, and that these companies employ more than 400,000 people. In comparison, second on the list of defense jobs in Europe is Germany with 75% less, at just over 100,000. France has long been arguing for a more integrated European procurement and defense system. It started with de Gaulle, while several other presidents after him did the same. François Mitterrand, for example, argued that France should offer to help other EU nations develop a nuclear deterrent themselves. He wanted a standing European army, and that Europe should focus on helping each other. Emmanuel Macron did the same in 2020, when he said that France was more than willing to discuss France's nuclear umbrella with the EU after a near-constant rebuttal from US diplomats over having more say within NATO's European chapter. Europe didn't listen then, but with Donald Trump acting like an elephant in a porcelain shop with his allies, I think other nations have started coming around to France's idea. Henry Kissinger, previous US Secretary of State, once famously said, "It may be dangerous to be America's enemy, but to be America's friend is fatal." Europe needs to start thinking about Europe. France, and to a lesser extent Sweden and Finland, has shown the way. It's time for the rest of us to get on the Europe First train. We've got the education, values, and moral codes to do it if we can just stop squabbling about wars that happened before the US was even a country. France has set out the template. Will Europe follow?